Hello again. This is yet another response video. This one's going to be a little different than the last few, in the sense that in those, the emphasis was on people who had very definite opinions about things based on little or no knowledge of the subject itself. Well, in this case, most of the information that's presented here isn't in itself controversial. It's just that the creator draws certain conclusions from it, which I think are not at all warranted. And in order to strengthen their case, they call into doubt the sources of this information and make use of certain kinds of rhetorical devices to poison the well and to cast doubt on ideas with which they disagree. So, here's how it begins.
Have you ever paused to consider the uncanny architectural similarities between ancient cultures that were supposedly isolated from one another by vast oceans, thousands of miles, and centuries of time? Isn't it curious that mainstream science and archaeology rarely, if ever, confronts these similarities head-on? Why doesn't mainstream science talk about this more often? I mean, it's so obvious when you stand back and take a look. It's staring us in the face, and yet the professionals are not really talking about it.
Okay, so from the very start, he's trying to stack the deck in favor of his claim, which is that the architectural similarities between these widespread cultures are too similar to be unconnected. These similarities, he says, are uncanny. And how could it be that these different cultures, which are supposedly isolated by vast oceans, which of course they were, could have developed similar architectural forms? And why is it that, as he says, mainstream scientists and archaeologists haven't noticed it? It's staring us right in the face. After having encountered a bunch of material created or defended by flat earthers, I've become very sensitive to words like mainstream. I don't know that this guy has the same kind of implicit hostility toward academia or education in general that a lot of those people do. He does, after all, refer in this video to a lot of the things that archaeologists and scientists have discovered, and he does give them their due. But the fact that he portrays them as not being able to see what any normal person can does concern me more than a little. He also likes to use phrases like, "we've been taught," or "we've been led to believe." So again, we have this indictment of the professionals who, according to him, don't want to challenge the status quo.
And let's start with the most obvious striking examples. Let's take a look at the pyramids. For example, the step pyramids are found in ancient Egypt, pre-Columbian Peru, and even Cambodia. In fact, we have pyramids all over the world. And these aren't small, vague resemblances. We're talking about massive, geometrically sophisticated structures built in layers often aligned with celestial bodies and constructed using techniques that modern engineers still marvel at. Is this just a coincidence? Or could it suggest a deeper, more interconnected human past? Mainstream historians might argue that pyramids are just the simplest way to stack stones high, but that doesn't explain the uncanny engineering precision, the astronomical alignments, or the spiritual significance embodied in these monuments by cultures worlds apart.
So again, he calls these similarities uncanny, and he says that there must be something more to connect these structures because they're massive and the techniques used to construct them haven't been fully understood, which may be true, but it doesn't mean that there haven't been reasonable explanations, such as using rollers or nearby water sources to move stones and so on. But I would also call attention to another point he makes here, and which he mentions again over the course of this video, which is that these structures are often aligned with celestial bodies. This is, again, a generally accepted idea, but should we start from the assumption that it isn't likely that more than one culture would have done this kind of thing? They all had visual access to those celestial bodies. So why do we have to take the leap that they were somehow connected simply because they paid notice to celestial phenomena? Is it any less likely that many ancient cultures assumed that the Earth was flat and that the planets and stars were embedded in a sphere above their heads? Now he's going to talk about a specific aspect of this architecture, which is the use of trapezoidal doorways in a lot of these structures.
Another strange similarity is this. Take a look at this. This is the trapezoidal doorway. These doorways were found across a few different ancient civilizations. However, it's strongly associated with the Incas, pre-Columbian Andes, and also across the Egyptian civilizations. We see this in Machu Picchu in Peru. Many of the doorways and windows are trapezoidal, a hallmark of Inca engineering. The wider base and narrower top helped resist seismic activity in earthquake-prone regions. So it obviously makes sense why this type of structure was used.
So as he himself says, this would have been a logical building technique to provide stability in earthquake-prone regions, which would be especially important where buildings were made mainly of stone and you didn't have the concrete or archways that we have today, since those were only invented in the time of the Roman Republic hundreds of years later.
While less pronounced than in the Andes, we still see them in entrances. Across Europe, we have the Mycenaean and Minoan structures from Greece and the Bronze Age.
Just a note, that's Mycenaean. The Mycenaeans were the Greeks of the pre-classical era, whose kingdoms inspired the description of the invaders of Troy in Homer's Iliad, which was written several centuries later.
And most of the trapezoidal structures are found in Incan and Egyptian architecture. It's clearly abundant that other ancient civilizations also incorporated this same design within their architectural monuments. What's most puzzling is that these ancient cultures supposedly had zero contact. So how did they develop such a specific architectural feature? It goes beyond just stylistic choices. It's a technical solution employed almost identically in different corners of the ancient world.
So I think he's answered his own question here. Why is it these separate cultures developed this system? Because it solved the physical engineering problem. Now he's going to talk about shared burial customs.
Another compelling point of similarity lies in burial customs. The ancient Egyptians and the Incas crafted elaborate gold masks, used mummification, and positioned the arms of their dead crossed over the chest. Why? Why did they do that? Why were they expressing a shared spiritual belief? And how do we explain their near identical symbolic gestures?
So here he talks about masks and the way that the arms on a mummy might be folded, and he calls them specific. He asks, why did they do that? Why would they not have done that? And he talks about a shared spiritual belief and near identical symbolic gestures. But how do we know that their beliefs were similar? And how are we to determine that their burial practices symbolize the same ideas? Besides, there are masks from other places as well, and from other periods. So I really don't know how much we're meant to make of all of that.
And then there's the mind-bending discovery that the Egyptian mummies contain traces of nicotine and cocaine plants. These plants were native only to the Americas, so how could they find nicotine and cocaine plants? How could they find evidence of that over in Egypt? As I said, these plants were only native to the Americas. These substances were not known in Egypt, nor do they grow there. So how were traces of nicotine and cocaine plants found in ancient Egypt thousands of years ago when those cultures had no contact?
Now this is a very interesting point. Some Egyptian mummies shown traces of nicotine and cocaine would suggest that these substances were being used in Egypt, even though the plants that produce them are exclusive to the New World. This does seem to challenge the conventional idea that these civilizations would never have had any contact. But if this is evidence of that, it's the only evidence, especially when we consider all of the physical traces of Egyptian trade with people within Africa and as far as Central Asia, which we know about from illustrations and from actual physical remains. Plus, from the little reading I've done about this specific subject, it seems that there may actually have been sources of similar kinds of narcotics in Africa, which is, after all, a much more likely source. But either way, the way to approach a phenomenon like this, which we don't know much about, is to continue to investigate it, rather than jumping to broad conclusions. It's okay to say, for the time being at least, that we simply do not know.
But the connections don't just stop here. Let's explore the megalithic stone structures, because throughout the world, ancient sites reveal monumental megalithic structures built with stones of astonishing size and weighing dozens of tons. And these massive blocks were not only quarried and transported, but also fitted together with such precision that even a razor blade cannot pass between them. Across different regions, the stones often display strikingly similar features, distinctive tool marks, interlocking designs, and remarkably advanced cutting techniques.
So, here he's talking about megalithic structures, buildings made with very large stones fitted together, and how the techniques used to build them could not have been developed independently by these various cultures. But again, I would have to ask, how do we know they could not have done that? And does the fact that, as he mentions here, these stones were fitted so closely together mean of itself that they couldn't have developed those techniques on their own?
Of years. Now, skeptics argue that ancient civilization simply developed comparable building methods independently, which it sounds ridiculous. They're saying as if such knowledge were commonplace. It doesn't make any sense at all. But the similarities are so precise and widespread that it strains belief to suggest that cultures separated by vast oceans and time, sometimes separated by centuries, could have achieved such feats of engineering in isolation, particularly at times when they were not thought to possess the necessary technology. And even more striking, despite the advanced machinery and engineering today, replicating many of those ancient constructions today remains a formidable, if not impossible, challenge. Without, like I said, the use for modern tools, modern machinery, modern laser cutting techniques, it's not possible to create such incredible feats of engineering. So how did they do it thousands of years ago? And then why is it so similar across multiple different sites? And we're talking cultures separated by continents. Without ships or communication technology, they shouldn't be producing such similar results.
So he calls the idea that these techniques could have been independently developed ridiculous. I don't know how you decide that. And he says that it strains belief that they could have accomplished these things. Again, I don't know how you decide that. And the idea that they are, as he puts it, not thought to have had these abilities doesn't mean that they didn't. I'm reminded here of a tendency found among undergraduate term papers to use the passive form when asserting things that the student would like to say but doesn't have any particular basis for. Also, it's not possible to create such incredible feats of engineering. This is also the sort of refrain that we often hear from flat earthers. It's not possible that the conclusions of astronomers and physicists to be correct. Now, the idea that ancient peoples were able to do things that we can't imitate or even understand raises a somewhat different issue than what he's been covering so far. I mean that till now, his claim seems to have been that there would have been regular interactions between these different civilizations, which is in itself controversial, given the difficulty of making long sea voyages on the open ocean. But now we're approaching the notion that these cultures were taught or somehow guided in their construction techniques, which introduces the idea of lost but advanced civilizations, people who have these kinds of skills and would have passed them on to others, which is a whole other level of controversy.
This. Even more baffling are the symbolic and artistic parallels, the all-seeing eye motif in both Egypt and Mesoamerican art, the reoccurring use of obelisks, the elongated skulls found in multiple regions, and spiritual motifs that appear in ancient pottery, petroglyphs, and even gigantic geoglyphs visible only from the air.
So again, this idea of glyphs that would only make sense if viewed from the air harkens back to the ancient astronauts theme, which originated in, I think, the 1970s with the book Chariots of the Gods, which was very interested in the Nazca lines in Peru and things of that sort.
Mainstream science and archaeology often present a neat, linear timeline of human civilization, one that stretches back around 6,000 years. Everything we discover is expected to fit into this framework. It's nice and neat, isn't it? But what happens if evidence emerges that doesn't align with this narrative?
Now I come back to the idea that the professionals who study this stuff are deliberately avoiding the obvious conclusions because it would make their neat scheme of the past less neat. He says, by the way, that this scheme only covers the last 6,000 years, which is not at all true. And he also says that we should rethink the broader picture. So the question I would raise is, how exactly are we, or really the scholars and scientists, supposed to do this rethinking, and on what basis are they supposed to do it? Should they abandon the tools that they've been working with in favor of more sweeping and dramatic generalizations? Now he's going to talk about a very specific symbol, which he says we find in Gobekli Tepe in Turkey, which is, as he says, a very old site. But he wants to point out that we also find this same symbol in many other places.
regardless of the exact age, Gobekli Tepe rewrites our understanding of early human civilization. The site consists of massive T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing upwards and above 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. And these are not crude markers, they're finely carved, intentionally positioned, and decorated with exquisite reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. Amongst these carvings, one symbol stands out, and this is a motif or some iconography resembling a bag-like object. And this is where it gets intriguing. The same bag symbol appears at other ancient sites across the world, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, and the carvings of the Sumerian gods to reliefs at La Venta in Mexico, across India, Indonesia. These bag symbols are found all over the world. So let's step back and consider.
He calls this a bag symbol. But couldn't it just be a bag or some other sort of container? There's no reason to think that exactly the same object is being represented in these different reliefs. But it certainly could be, broadly speaking, the same kind of object. After all, we find lots of similar objects across cultures because, again, they would have been of practical use. Chairs, tables, various kinds of tools, knives, and so on. So I don't see why this particular object should be singled out, except for the fact that it is, of course, found at this very old site. Now he's going to talk about another very interesting piece of information, which is that the same DNA markers have been found in both the indigenous peoples of South America and the Aborigines of Australia. Now, the usual explanation for the ethnic similarities of Asians and people in the New World is, of course, that at some point they crossed over from Asia via Bering Strait when it was still a land bridge. And whether that applies in this case as well, or whether it should be considered as evidence of longer ocean voyages, which until now had not been thought possible, it does not justify where he is about to go.
To me, it makes far more sense that these civilizations either stemmed from a common origin or inherited their knowledge from a much older, advanced culture, one that predates the mainstream model of history by thousands of years. What do you think? Could the story of human civilization be far older and far more connected than we have thought or have been taught? And another thing while looking into this, which I found fascinating about our ancient past, is the fact that there is DNA evidence linking ancient cultures to places that modern science cannot explain. Recent DNA studies have revealed that around 30% of Native American DNA shows affinities with Middle Eastern populations, and that contradicts the conventional migration theory that suggests Native Americans came exclusively via a land bridge from Siberia. Even more astonishing, some South American populations show traces of Aboriginal Australian DNA dating back over 17,000 years. So how is it possible that we find Australian Aboriginal DNA only in South America, not in North America? Had these ancient travelers come from the so-called land bridge, their DNA traces would have been found in parts of Central and North America, but that is not the case. You can only find traces of this Aboriginal Australian DNA only in South America. Doesn't that suggest there was ancient oceanic travel between Polynesian, the Australian region, and South America? Unless humans were making long ocean voyages tens of thousands of years ago, there's simply no accepted mechanism by which these genes could have made their way across the Pacific. And these mounting anomalies suggest that the human history is far more complex than we've been told. Could it be that we're looking at the remnants of a forgotten global civilization, a seafaring culture capable of worldwide navigation, monumental construction, and cultural exchange? Have a think about it. Many ancient legends and texts speak of a lost advanced civilization. Plato called it Atlantis. Other cultures refer to it as Mu or Lemuria. Could the striking similarities found across ancient cultures be more than just coincidence? Could they represent a fragmented memory of a once thriving, highly advanced civilization, one that was wiped out by a global cataclysm?
So he ties together the advanced technology theme with the connection between different parts of the world theme by positing Atlantis. While it's true that Plato describes a place he calls Atlantis, this is something which he himself invented in order to contrast a democratic society like Athens, or his our form of ideal city, with a more imperialistic society along the lines of the Persian Empire. So there's no reason to think that anyone before Plato had even entertained the idea of such a place. For that matter, he places it in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, which to the Greeks of his time was effectively the end of the known world, because he wanted to portray it as a fictitious threat to both Europe and Asia, which it could only have been if it was within close sailing distance of both of them. As to the idea of the continent of Mu, this is largely the product of a 19th century English inventor named James Churchward, who in later life started investigating the similarities that the anthropologists of the time were starting to notice among various peoples of the world. Churchward's explanation for this was that there was a submerged Pacific continent from which people had spread out to the surrounding regions. But he also says that the basis for this claim is certain tablets that he said he had seen in India and which were written in a language that only 3 people could speak and which described this place and how it was submerged in the course of a single night. But I have to say that the idea of special tablets which are written in an unknown language in the middle of the 19th century does encourage comparisons with the whole story that Joseph Smith came up with in the U.S. and which became the basis of Mormonism. Then there's the idea of Lemuria, which started its life as a theory which was meant to explain the similarity of lemurs in both India and Madagascar. These similarities, like other biological similarities across the world, have since been explained by the theories of tectonic plates and continental drift, but these had not yet been known at the time that Lemuria was proposed. This means that Lemuria began as a more or less serious scientific hypothesis, which was then co-opted by better evidence theories. But it was taken up by a number of occultists and people interested in positing a much longer and more interesting human history. People like Madame Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy. I suppose we could also mention here people like H.P. Lovecraft, who, although he was a writer of fiction, was interested in the idea of a secret and very old history beyond the one that we know, and he did refer several times to Atlantis and Lemuria. So now he's going to come to his conclusions.
Real measurable data supported by archaeological discoveries, genetic studies, and comparative mythology found in cultures across the world. I'm not suggesting that mainstream science has everything wrong, of course not. Mainstream science and archaeology has done wonders. It enables us to investigate further and look into these incredible sites in more detail, and it enables us to answer more questions. But it also allows us to ask more questions about our ancient past, and those questions and investigations should be explored further. And it's becoming clear that some long-held assumptions deserve another look. The story of human civilization may not be a straight line from primitive to modern, as we're so often taught. Instead, it may be a cyclical saga, an epic of great rise, catastrophic collapse, and gradual rediscovery. Like an ancient echo reverberating through time, we may be living in the aftermath of a lost golden age with only scattered traces left behind. Now, I'm not claiming to have all the answers, far from it, but when we repeatedly see the same patterns with spiritual iconography, near identical structures, advanced astronomical knowledge, and now even genetic links appearing in civilizations separated by oceans, continents, and millennia, shouldn't we be asking deeper questions? How were these feats of engineering achieved? What knowledge was lost, and why are we so quick to dismiss the possibility that our ancestors may have been more connected and far more advanced than we have been led to believe?
I'm struck by the fact that he talks here about a great saga. I've studied a lot of history, and I'd say that people are often disappointed with the idea that it isn't really some sweeping panorama, which is how they like to see the passing of centuries and millennia, but more of a mosaic made up of lots of pieces of individual information, some of which might be more interesting than others, and which have to be worked with and interpreted. This, I would say, is the essential distinction between a historian and an antiquarian, someone who likes sifting through the remains of the ancient world because they want to embrace their romantic notions about the past. And I have to say that the writing in this video really does appeal to me because of how romantic it is. But again, that's not what historians do. That's what people who like to make movies like Lawrence of Arabia and Cleopatra do. And while the creator of this video clearly does want to see the past as a very dramatic cycle of rises and fallings, historians and archaeologists are not in the business of trying to justify or corroborate that kind of drama. It's also really interesting that he would bring up here at the end the idea of a lost golden age, because we find this idea going all the way back to the ancient Mesopotamians and to the Greeks, as well as, of course, the story in Genesis about the Garden of Eden. So it's a very old idea that at one time things were basically perfect, although some people living in our technological age have adapted this story to include all sorts of wonderful inventions that we ourselves might dream about but haven't yet achieved. If you're interested in the story of this idea, you might want to look at some of the episodes I've been doing on the history of the imagination, because I start with Mesopotamia and bring it forward all the way to modern science fiction. So I think that's all that I want to say about this. So thanks for listening. Please subscribe, and I will see you again.